Good evening, everybody. This is the Pass Ball Show, brought to you by JohnPielli.com, as well as St. Aloysius Church of Jackson, New Jersey. Stay tuned to a couple announcements we're going to have early in the part of next week of a couple new sponsors that are going to be joining the Pass Ball Show team. Today, if you're interested, the number is 732-364-3598. That's 732-364-3598. There's a couple different things that I want to talk about today. I'm going to get in a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about Howard Cosell because I think there's a lot to be digested there. And I think if you look at Howard Cosell and his life as it went through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and of course towards the latter part of his life in the 80s, you make a comparison to the way the media covers people now, he would be a story that would be consumed by all types of news media every single day. And the tabloids would be all over him. Now, they were during the course of, the 70s and the 80s. But I tell you, this guy would probably be more popular than anybody that you could possibly imagine. We will touch on that in a little bit. But I'm going to start off, I want to talk a little bit about baseball and the arbitration process, but not in a boring kind of way, not in a way that I'm going to, get into, all types of details. But a lot of people don't understand the Major League Baseball arbitration process. And it seems like it's something pretty simple. And like I said, if you are a, fair weather to non-sports fan, you might be like, well, whatever he's saying right now is kind of stupid and just is completely irrelevant. But I'm going to try to make something of this. The baseball and its players have an agreement that they can go through something that's called the arbitration process. So you got a team that has its own players, and they agree on contract numbers for the next season. And if there's any doubt over whether the team wants to offer less money or the player wants more money, they settle through an arbitration process. And we understand that. Anybody that knows anything about law knows that, there's a mediator in the middle. One side gives their case, the other side gives their case, and in the middle there's a decision that's made. But what fascinates me about the arbitration process in baseball is it essentially pins a player and the player's agent against their own team. Now you think about it, in a court system would work kind of the opposite. You understand why there is different interest in regards to a court case. You have one side, whether it's a defendant or a prosecutor, that wants one outcome, and the other one is looking for a different outcome. Obviously, in a civil court, it involves money. Obviously, in a criminal court, it involves, the freedoms of the person that is being charged. So when we talk about arbitration as it applies to baseball, you're actually talking about a player being taken on by his own team. And if you caught the comments for Blue Jays pitcher Marcus Stroman that he mentioned today after his arbitration hearing, you could tell that there probably isn't very few cases that go to arbitration in Major League Baseball that doesn't leave at least a little bit of a burn or a scar or perhaps long-lasting feelings that are not, positive at all. Marcus Stroman plays for the Toronto Blue Jays. So the Toronto Blue Jays today in his arbitration case are knocking him. They're just telling the judge how bad of a pitcher Marcus Stroman is. How he is, not dependable. How he's maybe a little bit overrated. And in no case is worth the amount of money that he's asking for. So if the Blue Jays think, and obviously this is one situation out of the hundreds of arbitration cases you hear in Major League Baseball over the last several years. But if Marcus Stroman is as bad as the Toronto Blue Jays say he is, then what does that say about the Toronto Blue Jays? And it goes back to last year where you got, ass clown Randy Levine of the New York Yankees, always trying to put his bravado into things, essentially challenging the manhood of Dellin Betances during his arbitration case, basically saying that, he's not worth it. He's got something wrong with him if he's going to challenge the Yankees and their decision to pay them or pay the player what, the Yankees want. But I think in baseball, you're looking at something, and I think down the road, we may see a change in this process. And I don't know the exact way to go about it. I mean, is baseball going to be better off if they get rid of arbitration? I don't know. I mean, if they do, they'd have to substitute it with something else. But, looking at it from this perspective, I think that the players that are being involved here have every right to take issue with the teams that they happen to play for. And I think the same thing could apply to anybody at anybody else's job. If you want to make a certain pay rate and, your boss doesn't feel like you should be making that pay rate, and somehow you end up in some kind of binding arbitration, you're going to talk to the arbitrator and make your case why you're worth every bit of that salary. And your boss is going to go to the arbitrator and tell them every reason why you shouldn't be paid what you're paid. And very likely, if the case goes to arbitration, there's going to be some caught feelings on either side. The boss, if he ends up losing, is going to be ticked off that he's going to have to pay that person more than what he thinks that person's worth. And we all know the other side. If you're a person that, is striving for a certain salary and you don't get it, you're going to feel very much like you're underpaid. So what usually happens in some cases, if the person or the employee doesn't get the amount of money that they're looking for, they probably go elsewhere for it. Well, in baseball, in the arbitration process, you cannot. So what ends up happening is you have a player, in Marcus Stroman's case, who loses his arbitration case, but literally had to sit there next to his agent while his own employer, the own team that he plays for, was basically telling him how bad he is. And telling him that there's no reason that he should be making the money that he is. So where does that leave a Marcus Stroman? And like I said, he's the example here. Maybe the hypothetical and the argument that I'm putting together here. But you actually have right now in Major League Baseball players that are playing for teams that they've been with for a long time, and then having to go to an arbitration process and essentially fight with the teams that they play for and say, hey, I'm worth this. And the team says, no, you're not. And not only says that you're not worth it, but basically tells you that you're garbage. Basically tells Marcus Stroman that you're a lousy pitcher, you're not dependable, you're a horrible teammate, or whatever other innuendo that the team could throw in there. Now, once you've done that, obviously, from the team's perspective, they're saying that just to win the case. Just to win the opportunity to pay that player less money than what that player is asking for. But you really think, from the team's perspective, that there's not going to be any hard feelings? That you could go through that, have to go to court with a place that you're already employed by, and all you're asking for in some cases is a 5-10% raise. And in order to get that, you have to win a case with a judge where your employer is basically telling the judge how useless and worthless you are. I mean, it's a process which I understand, and I know Major League Baseball teams, the players agents, have all done a much better job over the last several years. In fact, if you go back to the early part of the 2000s, there was a lot more cases going to arbitration involving players. And you'll find this year, out of the very large amount of players that were eligible for salary arbitration, just a very few of them had to go to an actual trial. And I think that's baseball understanding that, you know what, I'd rather not go to a judge and tell the player everything I could possibly think of that's bad about them. Because that's not good for morale. And how does this apply to baseball? Well, if you've watched the changes of Major League Baseball over the last couple of years, where has it gone towards? What kind of managers have been hired in Major League Baseball over the last, 3 to 5 years? The majority of the managers that were hired this past offseason and last offseason. It's essentially a messenger, a communicator, a guidance counselor. Somebody that, is basically there to coddle the players of today. So when you're hiring a manager that's basically sit there to be, to put player A on a couch and tell him how great he is as his therapist and listen to all his problems and tell him how much he loves him, tells him, says, I don't care, if your daddy didn't love you enough. I don't care if you went through a little problems as a child. I don't care if you have a little split situation at home where your wife just left you. But I want to make sure you know that I love you, that I care for you. And everything's going to be okay. So you look at the modern day salary arbitration situation, you're really making the furthest example for what Major League Baseball teams want in regards to their players to feel. So I would think that any team that would decide, unless it's a dramatic amount of money, unless we're talking about, in Major League Baseball terms, I would say somewhere around $1 million apart. Let's say, players looking for, $5 million and the team's only offering $4 million. Maybe a case like that should go to arbitration because that's a wide enough difference. But in some cases, you're seeing, whether it's the Baltimore Orioles, whether it's some other teams that are deciding to go to arbitration over sometimes $100,000, sometimes a couple $100,000. And we understand in baseball terms, that's not a lot of money. How much money in baseball should you be a part in regards to what a player wants and what a team is looking to pay a player before you could say that it is actually worth it to go through with the arbitration process? I think it's different. It's the way that player is going to come out feeling like they're treated. Because there's no way you could go into a situation like this if you're a team and you say, all right, this is going to trial. We are going to try to get the judge to agree that we should pay this player what we're going to pay him. And then whether you win or lose, you're still creating animosity with that player. And, whether it was the Yankees with Dellin Betances last year or the Blue Jays with Marcus Stroman this year, I thought the teams in this situation were being a little bit silly. Betances last year, I thought, was worth around, what the higher figure would have determined. And Marcus Stroman, who on the Toronto Blue Jays starting pitching staff would you say was even close to being the number one starter on that team? Nobody outside of Stroman. He's clearly their ace. I mean, if you want to suggest that maybe Aaron Sanchez is healthy enough this year, I mean, he couldn't stay off the disabled list for 2 weeks at a time last year. J.A. Happ obviously won 20 games in 2016. Wasn't as good last year. Stroman is clearly the ace of that pitching staff. So the Toronto Blue Jays thought that over the minute difference in this case, it was worth it to, without completely doing it, essentially severing ties emotionally with their top starting pitcher over a matter of a few $100,000. And like I said, I'm not talking about $100,000 as it applies to, the middle to low class person or your average American. I'm talking about a couple $100,000 as it applies to Major League Baseball, where the minimum salary is over $500,000 a year, where the average salary in Major League Baseball is somewhere between about $3 and $4 million, where each player gets every season. So in that case, we're talking about a mere couple $100,000. And the Toronto Blue Jays are going to have to ask themselves as we go down the road, is that couple $100,000 worth the severed relationship that it likely caused with Marcus Stroman? Was it the right thing to do over that little amount of money? Now, the Blue Jays ended up coming out on top. They did a better job, I guess, presenting their case. Or I don't know. I guess it all depends on the judge too, right? There's different judges that oversee all these cases. So, I wonder if there is a bias within the judge or there's not a bias within the judge. Maybe the Blue Jays presented a better case than Stroman and his agent did. Which, when you go to court, sometimes that's what it comes down to. But now you're looking at something that's a little bit deeper than the difference in the salary that Marcus Stroman was looking for and what the Toronto Blue Jays were looking to pay him. Because now you can tell his feelings are hurt. He's expressed it. I don't think it's going to take anything away in regards to what he performs in a season. He's going to give his best. The guy's hitting free agency at the end of 2018. I don't know where the Blue Jays were standing in regards to whether they thought they were going to sign him. And maybe taking a step back, maybe that was the reason why the Blue Jays wanted to challenge him. Maybe the Blue Jays had decided that after this season they were going to let him walk as a free agent. Because if they weren't, they've all but assured that right now. They basically told Marcus Stroman everything possible that's negative and bad about him to a judge. So obviously this relationship will probably end at the end of the season when Stroman becomes a free agent. He's sitting on what you call the walk year of his contract, so he has a chance that if he has a really good year, he could take advantage of it. He could be one of the top pitchers on next year's free agent market. Obviously, the top pitcher could very well be Clayton Kershaw if he chooses to opt out of his contract, his long-term deal that he has with the Los Angeles Dodgers. But Marcus Stroman, if he's a free agent, he's probably going to do pretty well. Is he going to do Yu Darvish well? 6 years, $126 million? I think the only chance that happens if he goes out there and becomes a Cy Young Award contender, which he hasn't shown yet in his career. It's been a little while. But I do think Stroman had a good year last year. I think he pitched well enough. And the Toronto Blue Jays are going to be counting on him a lot. There's no question about it. They're going to look at Marcus Stroman to lead their pitching staff. The last couple of years, going back about 3 years when he had Mark Burley, a couple of years ago when they had R.A. Dickey, they were looking for somebody to lead their staff this past year. And Marcus Stroman really had his best season that he's had in his major league career. Of course, he had that, unfortunate injury a couple of years ago, finished the season by making a couple starts, had a down season in 2016, but was very good last year. ERA in the low threes, threw over 200 innings. Talk about the lack of importance of wins, but I'll use a statistic called ERA plus, which is an adjusting of ERA based upon the ballpark that you pitch in. And 100 is set at the barometer to be even, or your average and ordinary pitcher. Well, his ERA plus was 149 last year, which is outstanding. And you look at him at age 26, as he's going to be 27 this year before opening day, or I'm sorry, May 1st. So it'll be right after the season starts. You're looking at a guy that a lot was expected out of him in 2016, and he didn't really rise to the occasion. But last year he was a lot better. He certainly pitched like the number one. Was in the top 10 in the AL Cy Young Award voting. Won a Gold Glove. And was basically treated as if he was a piece of crap from his own team. And listen, some people understand that it's the nature of the business. Some people understand that it's what the game is about. The business aspect of it. If your performance is bad, a team's going to let you go. If you're not very worthwhile to your team, they're going to look to trade you, or they're going to look to move you. They're going to look to take you out. They're going to look to replace you with somebody else. All that's understood. But that's strictly based off of performance. And I think most people could say that about their jobs. If you don't do your job well, your employer has the right to find somebody that's better at doing your job than you are. But it wasn't the case with Marcus Stroman this year. I mean, you could make a very good case that he was one of the top 10 pitchers in the American League last year. Very well one of the top 15 or 20 pitchers in all of Major League Baseball. And he went to court today with his team over a couple $100,000. And basically he looked like a person that didn't belong there. Now, this coming year, and I stand corrected, he's not a free agent until the end of the 2020 season. So he's got a couple more years left. So I will tell you this. You could probably take it a step further from what I said before. You have a pitcher that has to go through this intense trial against his own team. And his own organization, the people that he works for, are ripping him, basically telling him how he's no good. Yet you're talking about the best pitcher on the Toronto Blue Jays staff. Marcus Stroman is going to have salary arbitration at the end of next year. The Blue Jays, if they know what's good for him, will make sure that they agree on a contract with Stroman before it goes to a trial next year. Because I tell you, if you do this more than once, you're going to find that there will be some real bad blood. And I think the Yankees learned their lesson last year. Randy Levine, the asshat that he is, saying, whatever it is that he said, cooler heads prevailed. Whether it was the Steinbrenners, whether it was Montrose, whether it was Brian Cashman. They all assured that Dellin Betances didn't go to arbitration again. And they agreed on a contract with him. Blue Jays would be very smart to do the same thing. Once again, John Pielli, happy to be with you. The number, if you want to join the program, is 732-364-3598. That's 732-364-3598. Want to give a couple updates on a couple guests we will have on a program next week. Long-time writer and most recent writer for the Star-Ledger, but a man that has been part of media for the past 50-plus years, Jerry Eisenberg, will join the program sometime next week, as will an author by the name of David Bonson. He wrote a book called Crisis of Responsibility that I've glanced over and found some very good points in there. We will discuss that on the show next week. Now, one of the things I'm going to touch on when I speak with Jerry Eisenberg, he was very much cited in the biography for Howard Cosell, written by Mark Rabowski. And I suggest anybody that reads books, whatever book you choose to read, as we hit the halfway point here in the Passball Show, no need for a reintroduction. We just did one. But anybody that is a fan of reading or wants to read a book that they have interest in retaining, I suggest you read it twice. And that's what I did with this Cosell book. It's called The Man, the Myth, and the Transformation of American Sports. And describes pretty in depth of pretty much Howard Cosell's entire life. Now, Howard Cosell wrote over the course of his life 4 books. And they were all first-person perspectives. Early on, it was more about himself, but later on, it was more about airing the grievances he had with others. And for those that knew Howard Cosell, knew that there was a lot of issues in regards to being able to maintain any sort of good relationship with him. Howard Cosell, I look at as a person that opened plenty of doors for me and have set up doors that are open for me for the future because of what he did in the world of sports broadcasting and reporting. Without Howard Cosell, there's a very good chance that the media landscape as it exists right now, at the very least, would not be the same. How would it exist? I don't know. But he was willing to do things that other people were either afraid of or just plain didn't feel like doing. You know, he traveled around spring training stadiums at the time when there was no technology. You didn't have an iPhone that you could sit there and just hit a button and record. He had to lug around with him about 40 to 50 pounds worth of equipment just to be able to hopefully save a couple minutes of tape in the interviews or discussions that he was recording. And he also did something else that was very different. It hadn't been done at that time. He had the balls to take on controversial sports topics. And he had the ability to get himself in the right position to ask, in some cases, the wrong questions. And I say the wrong questions when, sometimes the questions that the outsider may say, wow, I can't believe he asked that. But it was being done at a time where nobody had the eagerness or the confidence to do it. And part of what people despised about Howard Cosell made him as great as he was. The fact that he was willing to ask, in a lot of cases, questions that nobody else would have the balls to ask. Did he cross the line a number of times? Absolutely. But he, at least in temporary levels, gained the respect of some people he was talking to and always gave the story. And another thing that you really couldn't question about Howard Cosell, you always knew what his motives were. And as much people that didn't like him and soured on him and felt that Howard had turned their back on him or them, especially in his latter years, especially in the late 70s and the 1980s, and before his death in 1995, he became very bitter. He did. And if you look at what he did and what he accomplished to the world of sports and a world of reporting, I think most of it centered around the fact that he never got enough respect. He opened the doors for a lot of different journalists and broadcasters. And I was happy to be able to reach out to Jerry Eisenberg, who was one of the frequently cited reporters in Mark Grabowski's book. And Jerry's up there in his late 80s. And, you know, from the discussion with him, he sounds like he's doing just fine. You know, so in addition to talking about Jerry Eisenberg's career, which has been tremendous, you know, more than 50 years in the business, I do want to get some perspective on Cosell. Because I did hear a couple lines from, let's say, an Al Michaels. And Al Michaels, you know, was known to not get along with Howard pretty much from the beginning. And Al Michaels said very calmly in an interview that Howard got pretty ornery in his latter years. And a lot of it had to do, like I said, to the lack of respect that he felt he was getting. He didn't get I guess in his own mind, that, you know, he should have been given more credit for some of the things that he did and some of the contributions he had to the game. He would watch in the days of Monday Night Football, you know, guys like Don Meredith and Frank Gifford get Emmys. But Monday Night Football doesn't become a hit without Cosell. And I also remember, you know, watching the Howard Stern movie, Private Parts. And there was a reference made into it when they were talking about his ratings being so good. And it was talking about the certain percentage of people that listen to Howard Stern because they love him, or they like him. And the number one answer that was given to why they continue to listen to him is because they want to know what he's going to say next. And then there was the other side of it, of how many people listen to the show, say they absolutely hate him and despise him and can't stand him. And the number one answer that was given was that they wanted to know what he was going to say next. And the same thing applied to Howard Cosell. And I know he gained prominence for, you know, supporting Muhammad Ali during Ali's exile. And in a day and age where, you know, there was a lot, you know, racism as it exists in this country now was a lot worse back then. And Muhammad Ali's right to, number one, have a freedom of his own religion. And number two, which was the tougher part, his decision to not want to serve in the United States military. And there's one thing I want to talk about that, and I'll make this part quick. You know, Muhammad Ali is looked down upon for that by a lot of people, especially people of, you know, the 1960s, when, you know, thousands and thousands of young men and women were going off into the armed forces, and a lot of them didn't come home. But Muhammad Ali, through his freedom of religion, went from being Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali. And I wonder if there was anything ever presented to Muhammad Ali. In other words, would you sign up for the military as the name of your choice? Would Muhammad Ali have taken it differently if he wasn't on the lines hearing his name called and hearing Cassius Clay? When he had changed his name legally to Muhammad Ali. If the person, you know, whatever, the higher up officer called out his name and said Muhammad Ali, would he have continued and served his country? Because that seemed to be a barrier at that time. The fact that, he was up to fight, whoever it was, and they were calling him Cassius Clay, and they're in the ring, and Muhammad Ali is, socking him once, socking him again, saying, "What's my name? What's my name?" You look back at that time, and obviously it was Howard Cosell who stood by his side the entire time. But also what Howard Cosell did with Monday Night Football. Because there was no Monday Night Football without Howard Cosell. And you could tell. And listen, towards the latter part of the 70s, Howard became very tough to listen to. He sounded like that bitter old nasty man that just seemed to hate life. And every single thing that was brought up, he'd bring up something negative about it. That wasn't Howard in his prime. When Howard was out there using his intelligence. And maybe at that time or early on, you were talking about the late 60s and the early 70s, when Monday Night Football is coming into its prominence. Maybe Howard was doing that more for himself. But in the later years, he probably cared a little less. But even the sound of a lot of his broadcast, especially the early 80s doing Monday Night Football, he was a little more quiet doing the baseball games for ABC. But it became a little bit tough to listen to. But I tell you look at a guy and you wonder if sometimes the society around you and the adversaries that were either going to be there regardless or were created by you, the person, you're creating your own enemies, ends up defining what you end up being. In other words, can you legitimately treat people badly and somehow be remembered positively, for it? And I make the connection between the chicken and the egg. People are going to be nasty to you if you're nasty to them. But conversely, you're going to be nasty to people that are nasty to you. So at some point it has to start. And my assumption, or at least what I saw and read about Howard Cosell, was that he was very controversial. Right off the bat, he made the fact that he knew kind of who he was. And that led to a lot of people disliking him or giving him a hard time. And as time goes by, Howard gets more and more bitter about this. And I'll tell you, for a guy that, and like I said, number one, he's one of the people that I look up to in the world of broadcasting. If there